So we'll get started here. Please help me welcome Neeraj. Neeraj is our Chief Operating Officer at Aplusify and works with clients around the world, associations and nonprofits, working with them to really understand what their business processes are and how that affects how they use Salesforce. And I think one of the biggest things that always comes up is all the applications an organization uses and how do they get that to sync up and work correctly with Salesforce. So welcome, Neeraj.
Thank you for the introduction, Vino, and thanks for inviting me to this session.
So today, our agenda for today, we're going to go through a few slides, and Neeraj is going to give us as much information as he can give us, and we're hoping that you'll leave this segment with identifying some of the hurdles that you're going to incur when you actually do an integration. Some of the recommendations he suggests when you actually do those integrations, and then we'll give you some tools and resources to help you out there as well. Now, Neeraj, you know, something that you do work with clients on when you first talk to them is just kind of hearing about how they're using Salesforce and all of the other applications. When they want to start putting those applications into Salesforce, what kind of problems are you seeing?
As per our experience, we know when they are actually trying to integrate Salesforce with any third-party applications, the problems that they are able to see are more related to the objective and goals, because I think they are not set properly before we begin any kind of integration. And I think that is where we lack that evaluation criteria and that lack of strategic vision, which actually provides a lot of technical hurdles when we actually move to the actual part of API integration. So I think it's foremost important that when we are planning to do a third-party API integration with Salesforce, it's important that we set the objective and goals of our integration properly and do our evaluation on the APIs that we need to integrate. I think in the next few slides, I can take you through the most important or the foremost challenges that every organization faces when they are actually doing the API integration. So the first and foremost is unresponsive third-party collaboration. Now, since we are integrating a third-party API, right, so it's very important that you need to have a complete knowledge about that API. Because unless you have that complete knowledge about what you are going to integrate, your system cannot be error-free and you will be faced with errors at the time of execution. And since it's a third-party API and you don't know much about it, right? So it's crucial that you have a proper documentation in place about the third-party API so that you know like what functions you need to integrate, how to make those calls, and are there any blocker or hurdles you can face while doing it. So when I was talking about planning part, that is very, very important to understand what APIs we are trying to integrate and whether we are able to get a continuous support from the third party or not. In most of the cases, we realize at the middle stage that the documentation is not there, the third party APIs are not able to support our integration, and then we fall into a loop. So I think that is what most of the organizations face. Moving on, I think the second point is related to data mapping, because when you are actually integrating a third system to your org, what you are actually doing is moving the data from here to other, right? So you have a source data, which is actually your data residing in your existing org. And then there is a target data, which is actually the third party data structure that you need to port to. So I think before we start that integration, the person who is actually involved in doing that integration should ask a few questions before moving on to the integration stuff. Now those questions, basic questions should be, what is the data that we are trying to extract? And what is our target data? So what is the source data and what are we trying to move? That is very, very important to understand. And are we actually dealing with one data sources, or there are multiple data sources in which we have to move data? Because depending on whether you want to move to a single data source or multiple data source, your strategy would be very, very different. And most of the times we have realized that when we have actually moved data, right, there are continuous changes that is happening in the data. So we need to understand whether the data migration that we are doing, that is a one-time activity, or there would be certain changes to it, and we need to schedule it and do a kind of iteration every now and then. So depending on whether it's a one-time activity or it's a continuous migration where we need to do continuous changes, our strategy should be defined according to it. And when we are talking about data, which is very, very important, one of the things that we miss is we don't keep a backup of the existing data that we have. And when the things fail, then obviously the data is also gone and it's corrupt. So the crucial question here is, how do I actually keep my existing data safe so that if things go wrong, I do have a backup on which I can rely back and have the data for all my members or customers that are there in my system. Unfulfilled connectivity requirement. Now, if that is very basic, because when you are integrating a third-party API, you are actually connecting to a third-party system. And it's like integrating two systems. And when you actually integrate two systems, a proper handshake is important. When I say handshake, we mean that the two applications that we are trying to integrate are able to talk to each other, and there is a free flow of information between them. Because unless we ensure that there is a free flow of information between them, the whole exercise of integrating it with third party is useless. And this can be achieved by actually testing our infrastructure and testing our network connectivity. Else, what will happen is we will realize it later, and then it would be a continuous loop of no response errors that would be getting from the third party system, and we will not be able to rectify it. So connectivity is very, very important, and this should be ensured before we start the actual integration. Moving on, end-to-end testing. Now, when I say end-to-end testing, obviously testing is always crucial because we are trying to move things from one system to another and trying to communicate with a third-party system. So we need to ensure that both these systems, the target system and the source data system, is properly tested. And this should not be a one-time activity. It should be a continuous testing process that we should be doing. So we should be continuously testing our system and ensuring that what we are actually doing is tested. So we call that approach as continuous integration and continuous testing approach. And that can be done manually as well. But we generally recommend that if we can use some kind of automation tools to do that end-to-end testing, that actually saves time and effort, and the reliability of testing is more. So if you're doing continuous testing, it actually helps you identify the bugs at an early stage so that they don't move to the live environment and we get real-time bugs or production bugs. It's always good to get those bugs at the development stage itself and rectify them so that we have no downtime in production. Then we have these API limitations. See, every API that we are actually trying to integrate has a different structure. So you may be trying to integrate a marketing app, or you may be trying to integrate Gmail, or you may be trying to integrate an ERP system. Now, the requirements for different APIs are different. So it's very important to understand the API structure before the entire integration process. And every API may have some limitations, right? So it may be that there are some restrictions which are present in that API, and we need to think about it before diving into the actual implementation, and remove those blockers and hurdles before we implement it. Because if we don't do this at the beginning, then in the middle, we may have to revert back all the changes, and which may result in massive loss of efforts and money for the organizations. So in most of the cases, these are the top 5 problems that we have seen during the integrations that happen. There are n different number of things, but most of the top 5 we talk about, these are the top 5 that we have experienced with our customers.
Neeraj, I like how you talked about a lot of the testing and the work that needs to be done before you deploy anything. It kind of reminds me of that saying when carpenters always say, measure twice and cut once. I think that's it seems like that's very appropriate to the world of API integrations. Before we move on, I actually have a poll. I kind of want to see what people are doing with their APIs. I'm going to launch out a poll, and it's basically, the question is, what type of applications are you currently using now? Take your time in answering those. We'll take a look at that at the end of the webinar. But yeah, so when you get a chance, take a stab at that poll. In the meantime, we'll continue. Neeraj, now, it's great to know that all of these things could happen. What are things that you recommend for associations and nonprofits to overcome some of these hurdles? What are things that they can do?
Yes, so I think there are a lot of, so these hurdles obviously are there, but obviously there is a solution to every problem. And if we take care of these 6 to-dos that are displaying in this presentation, I think that is the key for the API integration success. And I think let's take them one by one. So when we talk about master data, so obviously, as I pointed out in the last presentation as well, that we have a lot of data that needs to be migrated from one system to another. So it's very important that we have a comprehensive data integration map of the existing system, and it has all the data sources. So I think as an organization, where we need to pitch up is communicate with all the departments that we have, and identify the critical data flows that are required to be taken care of when we are doing an API integration. So you may have different departments in your companies, and everybody must be using Salesforce, and they have different usages and different data flows that they may have created, or workflows they may have created in Salesforce. So it's critical to understand, like, what are the critical flows that they think are important and should be migrated. So a proper level of communication has to be there within the departments to gather that kind of data integration map and identify those critical data flows. Most of the times, I think it's more of the IT team or the people who are actually doing the integration who are involved in these kind of processes, and they fail to communicate with other departments, and critical data flows are missed when we actually do the third-party API integration. So when we talk about data, right? So data has a lot of columns, right, and tables, which we actually call fields. So field mapping is another important stuff that should be taken care of. So when we are talking about source data and target data, right? So our source data is in Salesforce, and that has a different data structure to what we are planning to migrate to a third-party system. So it's very important to understand the data structure or the kinds of mapping that are there in the source database and the mapping that is there in the target database, and try to map those fields from the source database to the target database. So a customer name field, right, maybe a different name in the target database, or has a different value or a column name in a target database. So it's important to have that kind of mapping or a document in place before we do the actual implementation. And obviously this activity, manual activity, is tough to do. So we generally recommend to use visual data mapping tools to perform this activity. So if you're using any kind of integration tools, they generally provide a visual data mapping where you get a visual form of data structures for the source and target, and you can actually drag and drop and do a field mapping of the source database and the target database. Third is define custom object. As we know, we have a lot of custom objects defined in our org, which are like not out of the box features for Salesforce. It's very important when we are doing any kind of migration or API integration with third party to identify those kind of custom objects and fields that would be required when we are integrating it with the third system. Because if you have these kind of custom objects, it's mandatory to transform these customer objects and fields into that of your corresponding application field and align it with Salesforce. Because if you miss this activity, it is very difficult to migrate these custom objects, and they will actually act as a pain when you do the actual migration. So I think once you have done this transformation of custom objects into your Salesforce fields, this would actually help in simplifying your interactions, and the data at both ends can be integrated smoothly. Now moving on to flow of data transfer. Now, since we are talking about data and the flow of data, it's important to understand whether the flow of data is actually unidirectional, which means that it just flows from your source data sources to target data source, or is it bidirectional, which means flows and it is coming back to your system as well. And depending on the flow, your data integration strategy and criteria is decided. So for a unidirectional flow, you may have a different strategy. If it's a multi-directional flow, bidirectional, you need to have a different strategy in place. So I think all these things or to-dos, right, are really important before we actually do the API integration. Now, when we talk about data transfer, it's important to understand that we may require this data transfer maybe multiple times or one times. So we can broadly divide an integration activity into a manual activity, automatic activity, or maybe it's a one-time off activity which is done and then we forget about it. So it may be that it's just one time that we have to do a data transfer and then it's all gone. But if you think that we need to have frequent data migrations, like maybe there is a job, there is a change in data and we need to actually do that every week or monthly, and it's always useful to have some kind of automated scheduling planned in your system, so that you can actually schedule your jobs and they can run automatically. So as an example, right, you can set your data migration to launch at midnight daily, and that activity could last for a year. So every midnight that data transfer runs and the job is scheduled. So every morning when you switch on your systems, right, you will see that the data has been synchronized and both the systems are having the same frequency of data. So the data in your source target is actually the data in your target system, so that you don't receive user complaints that there is data mismatch into it. And as I was talking, right, so data, when you're doing integration, it can be a manual process or it can be an automatic process. So what you are basically doing is extracting the data from one system, transforming the data to the target system, and then just loading it to the target system. So what we are doing is an ETL process, which is extract, transform, load. So if we use an automatic process, which is actually provided by a lot of integration tools, if we can use, then they actually do this activity automatically. So they will extract the information from your source target. They will transform the data based on your rules, and that will ultimately get loaded into the target systems. So if we are able to actually do this kind of effort, where we can have an automatic system to do this ETL process, and it will actually help us in saving a lot of time and cost and effort. But to achieve this, I think you have to follow the first 5 points before moving to point 6. So I think these all things, if we are able to plan before we are actually implementing our API, that can actually provide a good solution for all the hurdles that we talked about in the last slide.
You know, Neeraj, I think this is all, I mean, this seems very technical and seems like a great process to flow and something great for a developer or a Salesforce admin to know and do. But how does this relate with a lot of associations and nonprofits in terms of like managing up with their C-level or to even peers in the organization that interface with Salesforce or their applications, but don't necessarily get the technical jargon? I'm wondering how important it is for these non-Salesforce techies to understand about this, you know, how much data gets synced, how often, and all of that. Is that a process that should happen before you implement some of these to-do lists, things on the to-do list? Or is it something that, you know, you, like, at what point do you involve those people or you educate those people about those items?
I think that is a good question, Venu. Obviously, when we talk about these 6 to-dos, right, and when we are talking about all this Salesforce API integration stuff, it's very important that we involve the people who are actually responsible for doing this integration at the very early stage. Because what we are trying to do is actually trying to map the business processes that we have in the organization and trying to map those business processes and move the data from one system to another. And I think if we can actually train the resources that are actually involved in this API integration to use some kind of best practices, I think that actually will help them to have a smooth transition from Salesforce to this third party.
Yeah, it seems like sometimes when we talk to some of the organizations that when, whether they have super users or they're hoping to have super users, that's been very helpful in the process of just understanding what that whole Salesforce instance or ecosystem is, and having that understanding gives them a little bit more empathy in terms of what Salesforce can do and what an admin or a developer may have to do. I want to go ahead and share the results of our poll. Can everybody see that there, you know, in terms of what types of apps you all are using? You see you've got membership management, events, and custom forms seem to be like the big to-dos there that everyone's using. I'm curious if you guys in the chat function, I'd love to know how many of you are, you actually have integrations within Salesforce for your apps as well. And while you do that, Neeraj, I'd like to ask you, now that we've got a sense of what we need to do, what kind of resources or training or what can an organization do to make sure that they can do all of this that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think there are different options we know that we can do, right? So one of the options is that if you have a team of resources that can actually work, it's a matter of training them into some tasks to get that done. And I think before doing that, it's very important to understand that this whole integration process that we are talking about, that is actually, this should actually be driven by the business processes, and it only brings value if we align all these integrations with our business process. There is no point in creating a complex integration model that does not add value to any business process. Because when we are trying to do an integration, right, so it's actually a business case. It's more about why the business users want to do that integration. It might help them generating more leads. It might help them connecting with social media to get their data from social media into their system. So there is a business case involved when we do this kind of integration. If you forget the technical aspect, I think most important we need to understand is that we need to understand the business process before going for the API integration. See, every system has a raw data, and if we don't transform that raw data into business information, it is useless for the business users. Because what business users are typically looking for is useful information that can be applied across the enterprise and that can help them in their business decision making. Therefore, raw data needs to be filtered and aggregated and enriched in the form that can be understood by the business and can help them out in taking their business decisions. So I think, and this activity is not just one-time activity that we are talking about. So it's not that you train the resources and they do the one-time activity of doing the API integration and then it's off, right? It's not like that. Because as you know, the data and the information in a system, right, keeps updating on a regular basis. So you may have more data into your tables. Your tables may need some kind of updation because out of the date tables and views in your systems is useless. So I think every integration process requires some kind of maintenance activity to sustain it. There must be someone who is responsible for taking the responsibility of this long-term success of integration. So you have done the integration, you have spent a lot of money on it, but if you are not maintaining that kind of integration, the data will go very stale and you will again fall into that loop where your whole exercise of API integration is useless. So if someone from the team is not ready to take that ownership of maintaining that data and maintaining that integration, this whole exercise is useless. And when I talk about maintenance, right, how are you going to maintain the system? See, resources in a organization come and go, right? So, and even if we talk about an organization taking help from a third-party vendor, they also change with time, right? So an organization may require one vendor at a time, but they're not happy and then they change it. So it's very important that we have a proper documentation of the entire process, the data fields and everything, so that, and that should be in the control of associations that are actually the owner of the data, so that any change in the system, right, it doesn't matter, right? They have that kind of documentation, and then there is someone who is actually the ownership to maintain the system. Then the information is in their control, and I think that is the best way. So the best practice is to have someone who is the owner of your system, who is the owner of the maintenance system, and someone who is responsible for documenting everything. So I think every organization should have a budget to have that kind of maintenance stuff going on a daily basis. Maybe we can say the housekeeping stuff or whatsoever, right? Otherwise, this whole activity is useless.
So Neeraj, can you talk to us a little bit more about some of the resources that organizations can tap into to help them do some of the administrative work, some of these housekeeping things that you're talking about?
Yeah, so see, I think I was talking about, so there are two options. You can have resources in your own team or an admin at your team who can actually do this kind of maintenance stuff. But when you are talking about integration, I think it's essential that, and the skills are limited for a resource. So it's always important to find someone who has got that varied skill set who can actually help you out with different integrations with your org. So when we talk about third-party vendors, obviously you should look at certain things in a third-party vendor. I think first and the foremost thing, obviously it's very basic that we should look out for is that the third party or the help that you are choosing from has a prior experience in API integration. Because unless that third party has a prior experience in the previous API integrations, they cannot guide you the steps or if they don't have a prior experience, it would be like a new playground that they would be experimenting the things in your org. And I don't think you would want that. So it's always important that you check whether they have that prior experience in integrating some of the APIs. Another thing, as I was mentioning before, they should actually understand the business processes. And that understanding is critical for any integration to work. As an example, if we talk about associations, right, they have a different way of dealing with their data, or they are integrating it with different systems which have a different data structure. So it's important that someone needs to understand how the associations work, what is their business model, how does their membership work, what are the different apps that they integrate to, and then decide on how the things work. Obviously, they should have a specific framework or a checklist for carrying out that integration activity end to end. And they follow the best practices that are there. I think if they have the prior knowledge of your business processes and they have a prior knowledge of integrating the APIs and they're able to actually do a tick and checklist, I think they will be able to guide you better and help you with their integration faster, I think. Because if third party does not know how to get it implemented, then it's actually a disaster. So you have to choose your third party vendor very, very carefully and ensure that he understands A, your business processes, and B, has prior experience of third party integrations. So I think these are the 2 points that we should look for, for all the resources, or if you want to train your resources, I think these are the 2 points that we should be looking at.
And outside of those third-party resources, I like going onto Salesforce Trailhead and how they really separate the training from a basic level to a intense developer level, providing not only also a community to talk to. I'm experiencing this problem. What are other people seeing, and how have you solved that? So those are great resources for those that are a little bit more technical and or just need to, or more DIYers, right? If you're trying to do it on your own. Now, you mentioned that there are some tools that are out there that one uses when you do integration. Can you walk us through some of those tools?
Yeah, obviously. See, tools are very important when it comes to integration. Because as I said, there are 3 ways we can actually integrate an API. One is a manual activity, which is actually very cumbersome. Then you have got these beautiful integration tools that you can use, which helps you automate the process. So I was talking about that ETL stuff where you can actually extract the data, transform the data, and just load it. So one of the tools, as we can see, is MuleSoft. And MuleSoft is one of the industry leaders in integration. And it has got unlimited access to thousands of APIs, which are easily integrable with Salesforce. And obviously, because it's an industry leader, it guarantees that kind of security and governance of data. So obviously, MuleSoft is one of the tools that we can actually use for integration as an integration tool, which will actually help you out. Then there is another tool called Zapier, which we can use. So obviously, I think this tool is ideal for associations and nonprofits because you require like almost zero technical knowledge to integrate your stuff if you're using Zapier. And one of the good things about Zapier is it integrates with your social media. So what you can do is your leads can be added into Salesforce directly from social media. And obviously you can filter those relevant leads and increase your lead generation process. So I think Zapier is one of the tools which I would highly recommend for associations around nonprofits because it's automated and obviously it's like very easy to use with zero amount of code to be written. If you don't have any custom classes or anything, I think it's very smooth to automate the entire workflow using Zapier. Then if we talk about some open source tools, I would talk about Talent. It is actually an open source tool. So obviously if it's an open source, it's cost effective. It has a very good ETL process. So it's actually allowed a lot of associations and nonprofits to make real-time decisions based on more because of the data that it produces. So it's more of data-driven tool where it runs on business intelligence and business analytics. And you can do a lot of playing with data. And obviously it's automated and it's open source, so it's cost effective as well. Then moving on, we have a tool called Jitterbit. So this is also a very flexible integration tools. It actually works for all the industry types, have numerous APIs to integrate with Salesforce. And obviously there are like thousands of predefined templates that you get along with Jitterbit to get things integrated. So there are many other tools that are there in the market. So I think if you talk about top four, these are the top four that I would suggest as using as Salesforce integration tools for your third-party integrations.
Neeraj, I actually have a question. If you have, but before I ask my question, wanted everybody to know on the webinar, if you have any questions, now is the time. You've got a techie expert here with us to answer your questions. Please definitely put those questions into the webinar chat and we can address them. In the meantime, Neeraj, I actually have a couple of questions for you. Now you talk about these open source tools. I'm wondering how tech savvy do you need to be to implement that? Is it something that you definitely need more highly developer skill set, something like a third party can present or a Salesforce admin can do? But at what level would you recommend someone using those kind of tools?
So you don't need a very high-techy guy, to use these open source tools, but obviously, as we have discussed during this webinar, right, when we talk about integrations, these tools can just help you to ease up the process. But the to-dos that we discussed, the 6 to-dos that we discussed to overcome those technical hurdles, that is important, right? So whether you use a tool or whether you don't use a tool, right, the checklist and the documentation remains the same. You need to do the data mapping before using a tool. Now, what these tools do is actually give you visual data tools to map your data source and the target data, right? They come up with automation processes like the ETL process, which actually extracts, transforms, and loads the data. But you exactly need to know what to extract and what to transform. So that kind of business process knowledge and technical expertise is required. Obviously, you don't need to write a lot of code because it's more of drag and drop. So obviously, not a highly technical resource do you require for it, but you require someone who has done that thing before. Because someone new, right, would need to understand that process of integration, because tools can only be used if you have prior knowledge of that tool. So obviously, we'll need the business expert who knows business processes to map our data. But you will require some kind of technical expertise before using these tools.
And then to kind of go, I probably should have asked this question in the very beginning, but for some of those that are on the webinar with us today that haven't done any integrations, can you talk about what the difference is between, if you have all of these apps that are working independently and aren't in Salesforce at the moment, what is the difference between the before and after integration? Like, talk a little bit about, what does that look like, and what's the value of having it all come into Salesforce?
Yeah. So see, why do we need an integration? Okay. So in an organization, in a typical organization, right, we have different silo systems sitting, which are actually not talking to each other, right? So suppose we take an example of a bank. Now, in a financial institution, you may have a separate mortgage department or a separate credit card department, a separate loan department, right? And you have different accounts for the same person in that same financial institution. So a person may be carrying a credit card of the same bank, and he may have a mortgage account with the same bank. But the sales team, right, they don't recognize that he's the same person. They may be selling the same thing to the same customer. So when you have systems which are like aloof from each other and they don't tie to each other, you don't have a single view of the customer, right? And that is applicable with every organization, whether it's associations, non-profits, right? So unless you get a single view of the customer or the business, it's very hard to grow that business. And it's very hard for the top management to understand what is going on in the organization. And when we say integration, what we are trying to do is making two systems talk. So we have an ERP system, right, like Fontiva, right, which is not connected to its marketing team. So we need that kind of integration between those tools so that the leads that are generated by the marketing team actually flow into the ERP and can be visualized in the one system. Why use two systems together? So when we integrate these systems together, right, we can have a lot of information which we can see as a single information, and that can actually help us grow business. That is the only advantage that we get when we integrate different systems together.
And then for, let's say for those organizations that have already gone through an integration, they've tried it, and something just isn't right. It just didn't go as well as they expected. What do they do now? Do you start all over? Do you bring someone in? What are some of the solutions that you can when you've got that uh-oh moment?
I think that is a very common problem that occurs with a lot of organizations when they integrate. It's not important that your API integration has gone smoothly and you don't face any issues, because we have seen that a lot of organizations who have actually integrated with third parties fall into a trap where they have migrated, but the testing has not been done, the mapping was not done proper, and now they have this problem of data duplicacy or junk data in the system. So same customer with a different name in one system and with a different ID in different system, and everyone is confused. So now the confusion with the organization is that they realize that they've already spent a lot of money on integration, and now they don't have that kind of budget to actually go from scratch and implement the system again. And that is not feasible as well, right? So what we have tried to do is we have tried to bring our expertise in place and understand what has went wrong and try to fix those issues. Or maybe if it is like a data migration issue that has happened, what we do is generally do data cleansing, and then maybe try to see what was the root cause and what was the problem in that happened during data migration, and try to fix it so that it is like you can have a list of the problems, and then based on priority we can get that fixed one by one. Because generally what happens is organizations don't want to spend a huge amount of money after they have already done it with one integration. They may want to fix the issues in chunk and get them sorted out maybe in a phased manner. And I think that is the best approach to do when you have messed up the approach and there are certain things that you want to improve. And that is why I was talking about that maintenance stuff. So once you have done that integration, it's very important that the person who has done that integration takes that ownership of maintenance and does that maintenance for you for a period of time, because one-time activity, you don't know, you have not tested it. And when you start using it, you realize that this is wrong, that is wrong. And then you don't have anyone to go to. So it's always better to have that kind of maintenance plan beforehand in place before doing the API integration, so that you are safe, that at least the damage has been done, but we have got a maintenance support contract. So let's, we have someone who can actually get this fixed and get the ball rolling.
It sounds very much like buying a car. And once you get that car, you've got to keep the maintenance up. Otherwise, it will break down on you. And when you want to add new shiny things, new shiny aftermarket add-ons to your car, then you can do it yourself, or you can probably ask someone to do it and do it right. Well, Neeraj, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us today on API integrations into Salesforce. Everyone on the webinar, thank you for joining us. If you have any other questions, you definitely can contact us at wecare@aplusify.com. We will be sending the recorded webinar out to everyone who joined us today. You can also simply reply to an email as well. We do have a blog series that gets into more detail about all the things that Neeraj talked about today. Again, if you have any questions or need any more information from us, we're happy to help you out. Just give us a call. In the meantime, everybody, stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you for joining us.